In 1812, on a field outside a village called Borodino, a French army surgeon wrote a number in his notebook that almost nobody back home believed. 200 amputations in under 24 hours, a knife, a saw, and nothing to dull the pain but the shock of the wound itself. The surgeon's name was Dominique Jean Larrey. He was not cutting limbs off because he enjoyed it. He was cutting because it was, in 1812, the fastest way to stop a man from dying of infection 3 weeks later in a fever tent that smelled of rot and unwashed straw. For most of history, everyone assumed a wounded soldier's fate was decided by the size of the wound. That assumption was wrong. It was decided by something far crueler: how long he had to wait and who reached him first. But here is what almost nobody talks about. Before the 20th century, the deadliest part of getting shot on a battlefield was rarely the bullet. It was everything that happened in the hours and sometimes days after it. A musket ball moving at low velocity did not usually kill instantly. It shattered bone, tore muscle, and buried cloth and dirt deep into tissue. What killed the soldier, more often than not, arrived later, carried on unwashed hands and unclean water. At the Battle of Eylau in February of 1807, snow fell so heavily that wounded men lost between the lines simply froze where they lay. Larrey walked that field himself and later wrote that some soldiers were found alive the next morning, their blood frozen solid enough to have sealed their own wounds shut. That detail changes everything that comes after. Before antiseptics, before anesthesia, before blood transfusion, the human body on a battlefield was left to fight two wars at once: the one that wounded it and the one that came for it afterward, slower and far more patient. Getting hit was only the beginning of the ordeal. In most 18th and early 19th century armies, there was no such thing as immediate care. A soldier who fell during an advance stayed where he fell until the battle moved elsewhere, sometimes for 6 hours, sometimes for 2 full days. Comrades were forbidden, under most military codes, from stopping to help a fallen man mid-charge, since doing so could break the formation and get everyone killed. Larrey saw this failure up close as a young surgeon attached to the French Army of the Rhine, and it disgusted him. In 1792, near the town of Speyer, he watched wounded men die not from their injuries, but from blood loss that 30 minutes of attention could have stopped. So he built something the armies of Europe had never used before: a horse-drawn cart light enough to gallop directly onto an active battlefield. He called it the Flying Ambulance. It carried 2 stretcher bearers and basic surgical tools, and it went in while the fighting was still happening, pulling soldiers out from behind the front lines instead of waiting for the smoke to clear. Officers thought he was insane. Riding a cart into cannon range to retrieve infantrymen made no strategic sense to men who had spent careers viewing soldiers as replaceable. But that was only half of the problem Larrey was trying to solve. Getting a wounded man off the field faster meant nothing if he then died waiting in line behind an officer with a scratch, simply because rank came before need. So Larrey did something that broke centuries of military tradition. He created a system of sorting the wounded, not by uniform or title, but by how badly they were hurt and how likely they were to survive with fast treatment. He called the most urgent category the dangerously wounded and treated them first regardless of whether they were a colonel or a private. Historians would later give this system a French name that entered every language on Earth: triage. It sounds obvious now. In 1812, it was radical enough that some officers refused to accept it, insisting their rank entitled them to be treated first, even while bleeding out slower than the private beside them. Once a soldier actually reached a surgeon, the ordeal that waited for him is difficult to describe without flinching. There was no anesthesia in the modern sense. Ether would not be used in surgery until 1846, decades after Larry's busiest years. What existed instead was raw alcohol, sometimes opium if the Army's supply lines had not failed, and often nothing at all beyond 4 or 5 strong men holding the patient down. The popular image of a soldier biting down on a bullet is mostly myth. What surgeons actually used when anything was available was a thick strip of leather or wood clenched between the teeth, not to numb pain, but to keep the patient from breaking his own jaw or biting through his tongue while he screamed. Surgeons worked fast, not out of skill alone, but because speed was the only mercy available. A skilled amputator in Larry's era could remove a leg above the knee in under 2 minutes, because every extra second was agony with no relief. The tent itself had its own atmosphere, one that survivors described more than they described the pain. Canvas walls soaked with old blood turned a deep brown that never fully washed out. The air was thick with the smell of burning, cauterizing irons pressed against open wounds to stop bleeding. A smell one field surgeon compared to scorched meat left too long over a fire. Men waiting their turn could hear everything happening to the man ahead of them, and there was nowhere else to look. Survival past the surgery itself was its own separate war. Doctors in the early 1800s did not yet understand that invisible organisms caused infection. The dominant medical theory held that pus forming in a wound was a good sign, a natural part of healing that physicians called laudable pus. Surgeons moved from patient to patient, using the same unwashed instruments and the same unwashed hands, unknowingly carrying infection from one open wound directly into the next. Gangrene killed more soldiers in most pre-modern wars than the fighting did. In many campaigns across the 17th, 18th, and early 19th centuries, disease and infected wounds accounted for roughly 2 out of every 3 military deaths, far outpacing anything caused directly by a blade or a bullet. A soldier could survive a musket ball to the shoulder in the morning and be dead from fever within 9 days, his wound turning black and swelling with a smell that surgeons of the time knew meant the end had already begun. There was little anyone could do at that stage beyond administering opium to ease the final hours. Larry himself documented amputating already gangrenous limbs as a last resort, knowing that even that drastic step often came too late. Here is the detail that no one who tells this story remembers to include. The soldiers who fared worst were rarely the ones hit hardest. They were the ones hit farthest from help, in armies too poor or too disorganized to move a surgeon anywhere near the front lines. Russian infantry in the early 1800s, for example, often had one surgeon assigned to several thousand men, meaning a soldier wounded at the edge of a battle line might wait a full day before anyone with medical training even saw him. By the time the American Civil War began in 1861, roughly 50 years after Larry's flying ambulances first rolled onto a European battlefield, almost nothing had changed in terms of actual medical understanding. Surgeons on both sides still worked without knowledge of germs. A surgeon named Jonathan Letterman, serving as medical director for the Union Army of the Potomac, would eventually build on Larry's triage system and ambulance corps, creating an organized evacuation chain that historians now credit as the direct ancestor of modern battlefield medicine. But in the years before Letterman's reforms took hold, wounded men at battles like Shiloh in April of 1862 lay on open fields for 2 full days before stretcher bearers reached them, some drowning in shallow pools of rainwater because they were too weak to lift their own heads. Survivors later described a sound that stayed with them longer than any cannon fire, the low, constant moaning of thousands of wounded men across a field at night, a sound one witness called the peculiarly depressing and vast wail of pain, unlike anything he heard again in his life. But the real question was never how many men died in combat. It was how many died afterward, in tents and wagons and roadside farmhouses, from wounds that a modern soldier would walk away from with a bandage and an antibiotic. Larry's own story ended in a way that reveals something about how even enemies understood what he had built. At the Battle of Waterloo in June of 1815, Larry was working to treat wounded soldiers under enemy fire when he was captured by Prussian troops, who, by most accounts, intended to execute him on the spot as a French officer. A Prussian surgeon who recognized his name is said to have intervened, and word reportedly reached the Duke of Wellington himself, who had encountered Larry's reputation for treating wounded men on both sides of a battle without distinction. Wellington is said to have ordered him released unharmed, reportedly remarking that he would not let so brave and so good a man be lost to a firing squad. That detail matters more than it first appears. An enemy commander intervened to save the life of a man whose only weapon was a surgical knife, because Larry had spent 20 years proving that a wounded man's life was worth saving, regardless of which uniform he wore. By the time Larry died in 1842, the practices he pioneered had already begun spreading through European and American armies, though the deeper breakthroughs were still decades away. Joseph Lister would not publish his findings on antiseptic surgery until 1867. Blood transfusion would not become reliably safe until well into the 20th century, after the discovery of blood types in 1900. For most of the men who fought and bled in the centuries before those discoveries, survival came down to distance, timing, and whether anyone with a cart and a blade could reach them before infection did. The soldier lying wounded on a battlefield in 1792 or 1812 or 1862 was never really fighting one war. He was fighting a second one, quieter and slower, that began the moment the first one ended for him, and that killed far more of his fellow soldiers than any army ever did. Back at Borodino, in the smoke and the frozen mud, Larry's 200 amputations in a single day were never really about the number itself. They were about a soldier who no longer had to wonder whether anyone was coming for him at all. He didn't invent a cure. He invented the idea that someone would come,